Used everything we had to save my husband's life. $500,000. Our catering business. My grandmother's ring. The day he came home from the hospital, I found a wire transfer on his phone. $300,000 sent to her account the week before his diagnosis. I wiped my eyes, fixed him a cup of tea, and then I called my accountant. My name is Lily, and I'm 32 years old. The man currently sleeping in our guest bedroom, because he said the master bed was too soft for his recovery, is my husband, Marcus. 6 weeks ago, he was dying. I don't say that dramatically. The doctors actually used that word. Stage 3, pancreatic cancer, aggressive, moving fast. His oncologist, Dr. Ter Webb, sat us down in a small office that smelled like hand sanitizer and old carpet, and told us that Marcus had maybe 8 months without intervention and a fighting chance with an experimental treatment program at a cancer center in Houston. The cost wasn't covered by insurance. The program was new, the approval was pending, and the price tag was $480,000. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my side of the bed listening to Marcus breathe and doing math in my head. We had the catering company, Bright Table Events, that I had built from nothing over 7 years. Weekend weddings, corporate lunches, holiday parties. It was finally profitable. We had our house in Naperville, Illinois, the one we bought 3 years into our marriage when Sophie was born. We had a small rental unit 2 towns over that we'd inherited from my aunt, and we had about $60,000 in savings. Sell them. That was my answer before the sun came up. Marcus cried when I told him. Real tears, the kind I hadn't seen from him since his father's funeral. He held my hand and said, Lily, that's everything. The business is your whole life. And I said, you are my whole life. The business I can rebuild. Sophie was 4. She needed her father. That was the only math that mattered. What followed was the most exhausting 8 weeks of my existence. I found a buyer for Bright Table, a competitor who had wanted it for years. I took less than it was worth because the timeline was urgent. I sold the rental unit. I took out a second mortgage on our house. I negotiated with the treatment center, spoke to their financial coordinator so many times that she knew my voice before I said my name. Every signature felt like bleeding out, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. We would rebuild. Marcus would be well. We had time. He completed the program in Houston. I drove him there myself, stayed in a residence inn for 2 weeks, ate vending machine dinners while Sophie was back home with my sister. Marcus was weak and quiet and grateful. He held my hand in the treatment center lobby and said, I don't know what I would do without you. I believed him. That was my first mistake. He was declared in remission 11 weeks after we started treatment. Dr. Webb called it one of the stronger responses they'd seen. Marcus cried again. I cried. My sister drove over with Sophie and a grocery store cake that said congrats in blue frosting. We took pictures. I posted one on Instagram. People I hadn't heard from in years sent heart emojis. I thought the nightmare was over. The first sign was small. 3 days after we got home, Marcus said he wanted to take some recovery walks in the morning, alone. He said the solitude helped him process everything he'd been through. That seemed reasonable. He'd face his own mortality. Of course, he needed space. The second sign came when I was doing laundry. His phone was on the edge of the washing machine and a notification slid across the screen. I wasn't trying to look. I genuinely wasn't. But I saw the name, Adrian, and the preview of the message. I'm so relieved. I can't wait to... The screen went dark. I stood there holding his gray Henley for probably 30 seconds. Then I put it in the machine, added detergent, and started the cycle. My hands were steady. I noted that. Even then, something in me knew to stay steady. The third sign was the wire transfer, and that one I actually went looking for. It was a Tuesday evening. Marcus was asleep early. The fatigue from treatment still hit him hard some nights. Sophie was in bed. I was sitting at our kitchen table going through our joint account statements because I needed to understand exactly where we stood financially. We had the house, the mortgage on it, about $40,000 left in savings, and I was already starting to think about what came next for work. And there it was. 11 weeks before his diagnosis. A transfer out of our joint savings account for $300,000. The recipient account was labeled only with a routing number I didn't recognize. I sat very still for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. The neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. $300,000, gone before he was even sick. Before I sold my business. Before I sold my aunt's rental. Before I remortgaged the house where my daughter sleeps. I did not go wake him up. I did not throw anything. I went to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and sat on the edge of the tub. I let myself feel it for exactly 5 minutes, the dizziness, the nausea, the specific grief of realizing you have been catastrophically wrong about something you staked your entire life on. Then I stood up, looked at myself in the mirror, and made a decision. I was not going to react. I was going to find out everything first. I have a college friend named Rachel who became a forensic accountant. We hadn't talked in almost a year. I texted her that night, "I need your help. It's urgent, and it has to stay between us." She called me back in 4 minutes. I told her about the transfer. She told me what she needed to trace it. I photographed the bank statement and sent it to her encrypted. Then I went back to bed and lay in the dark next to Marcus and kept my breathing even. What I found over the next 2 weeks changed every single assumption I had made about my marriage. Rachel traced the transfer. It had passed through a business account registered to something called Lakeview Consulting, LLC, incorporated in Delaware. The registered agent was a woman named Adrian. Rachel pulled her business filings. Adrian had also recently incorporated a separate LLC, a boutique event planning company, the kind that competes directly with what Bright Table had been. Her startup capital had arrived as a lump sum approximately 3 weeks after Marcus's wire transfer. He had funded her business, with our money, while he was healthy, before the cancer. I needed more, so I called a private investigator. I found him through Rachel, who had used his firm on a case. His name was Ellis. He was methodical and did not seem like someone who would sensationalize anything, which was what I needed. I told him what I had. He told me what he could find legally. I told him to proceed. While Ellis worked, I focused on being the perfect caregiver. I drove Marcus to his follow-up appointments. I made the soft foods his stomach still tolerated. I reminded him to take his anti-nausea medication. I helped him with his insurance paperwork. On the surface, I was completely devoted. Internally, I was building a file. Ellis came back to me after 9 days. He had confirmed that Marcus and Adrian had been in a relationship for at minimum 2 years before his diagnosis. He had records of hotel stays, nothing explicit, just the check-ins, the dates, the locations. He had a photo taken from a public parking lot of them having coffee at an outdoor table in a Chicago neighborhood 2 weeks after Marcus came home from Houston, while he was supposedly on his solo recovery walks. There was more. Ellis had found a draft document, obtained through entirely legal means he didn't elaborate on, that appeared to be an early version of a business partnership agreement between Marcus and Adrian. The structure was unusual. Adrian would hold 60% of a jointly operated entity. A footnote referenced a pending asset transfer. The draft was dated 3 months before Marcus was diagnosed. A pending asset transfer. 3 months before he got sick. I went through every scenario. Maybe he had planned to leave me before the cancer. Maybe the diagnosis had genuinely scared him into staying. Maybe he thought he could have both. Stay in the marriage, stay in the house with Sophie, and still funnel money to Adrian's business and their future. Or maybe, and this was the coldest version, the one that made my hands go numb, maybe some part of the plan involved me depleting my own resources to fund his recovery, leaving me with nothing if he ever decided to walk away. I don't know which version is true. Maybe all of them are, in pieces. I found a family law attorney named Mr. Okafor through a bar association referral. He was experienced in cases involving hidden assets and business fraud, which Rachel told me was specifically what I needed. I brought him everything, the bank records, Ellis's report, the draft partnership agreement, the photo. He read through it twice. Then he said, "Mrs. Calloway, what you have here is a strong basis for a divorce filing with a fraudulent transfer claim. The $300,000 move before his diagnosis is likely considered marital property that was concealed and dissipated. That, combined with evidence of a long-term affair, substantially changes what you would be entitled to in dissolution." I asked him what entitled meant, practically. He said that given the totality, my documented financial sacrifices to preserve the marriage and his health, the concealed transfer, the business dealings with a third party using marital funds, I would have grounds to argue for restitution of the transferred amount, a significant portion of any remaining marital assets, and primary residential custody of Sophie, which would likely be granted given Marcus's health limitations and employment instability during recovery. I told him I wasn't ready to file yet. I needed a little more time, he said. I understand, but don't wait too long. There was something I still hadn't accounted for, Adrian herself. Ellis sent me an update 2 days later. Adrian had been reaching out to Marcus with increasing urgency. He had managed to pull the rough shape of several conversations from publicly accessible metadata and a mutual contact who had unknowingly shared context. She was frustrated. The business wasn't where she expected it to be. The money wasn't enough to sustain what she'd built. She wanted more. She wanted a timeline. She wanted to know when Marcus was going to finalize things with me, and Marcus, it seemed, was stalling. I understood then what was happening. He hadn't expected to survive. The experimental treatment was a long shot. Dr. Webb had said as much. I think some part of Marcus had made arrangements for a future he assumed he'd never have to live through. He had given Adrian enough to secure her loyalty, promised her a future that looked real on paper, and fully expected that the cancer would resolve things cleanly before any of it became a problem. Instead, he was alive, and now he had a very angry woman on one side and an oblivious wife, so he thought, on the other, and he was running out of road between them. I watched him carefully over those next few days. He was more on his phone. He took longer walks. He started talking vaguely about eventually getting back to some kind of work consulting, which I had assumed was just restlessness, but now understood was code for figuring out how to resurrect the plan. One evening I came into the kitchen, and he was on a call in a low voice. He didn't hear me. I caught 3 sentences. I know. Just give me until after the 6-week checkup. Once the paperwork is clean, I'll move on the account. He looked up and saw me. His expression reset so fast it would have looked normal to anyone else. Client, he said. Just a client thing. How's Sophie? I handed him a glass of water and said, She drew a picture of our family today. She gave you a big smile. And I watched him look down at the glass, and I thought, You are going to lose everything. And the saddest part is that you did it to yourself. The 6-week follow-up was with Dr. Webb. Marcus was cleared. His numbers were excellent. Dr. Webb said he was one of the better recoveries the program had produced, which was genuinely remarkable. Leaving the clinic, Marcus was in a good mood, lighter than I'd seen him since before the diagnosis. He suggested we get lunch, just the 2 of us. I said yes. We sat at a quiet Italian place near the hospital. He ordered pasta. He talked about how grateful he was, how the experience had clarified things for him, how he wanted to be more present, more intentional. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. I looked at him. I thought about the wire transfer. I thought about the hotel check-ins. I thought about Adrian's company, funded with money from our savings account. I smiled and said, I'm glad you're here. 2 days later, I called Mr. Okafor and told him to file. What happened after that moved faster than I expected. The divorce petition cited the fraudulent transfer of marital funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and dissipation of assets. Mr. Okafor attached Rachel's full forensic accounting report, Ellis's documentation, and the draft partnership agreement. We also filed a separate civil claim for recovery of the transferred funds against Lakeview Consulting, LLC. Marcus received the papers at home. I was in the kitchen with Sophie when he came out of the guest room holding the envelope. His face had gone completely gray. He looked at me for a long moment. Sophie was drawing at the kitchen table, unbothered. He said, Can we talk about this privately? I said, Yes. Sophie, honey, why don't you go watch one show before dinner? She ran off happily. He sat down across from me. He tried 3 different starts. Lily, I know this looks, and I made mistakes, and you have to understand the timeline. Each time I waited. I didn't interrupt. I just waited. And each time he trailed off because there was nowhere good for any of those sentences to go. Finally, he said, The money I was going to tell you, things were complicated with the business and Adrian needed. I know who Adrian is, I said. I know about the hotel stays. I know about Lakeview Consulting. I know about the partnership draft. I know about the transfer timeline relative to when you were diagnosed. I said it calmly and quietly. I've known for a while. I just needed to know everything before I said anything. He looked like the floor had moved. He sat there staring at the table. I could see him trying to find the angle, the argument, the version of events that worked in his favor. There wasn't one. He knew it. What he said next surprised me. Not because it was unusual, but because of how automatic it was. He said, "I stayed, Lily. When I got sick, I stayed. I didn't leave." I looked at him. "You stayed because you were dying," I said, "and I am the one who sold everything to keep you alive. That's not devotion, Marcus. That's math." He had no answer for that. His attorney contacted Mr. Okafor within the week. They wanted to negotiate. Marcus was willing to acknowledge the transfer and discuss restitution. He was not willing to go to trial on the fraud claim, which made sense. A public civil proceeding would have exposed the full scope of what he'd done, including potentially to Adrian, who had her own legal exposure given the business structure. The negotiation was not pleasant, but it was mercifully short. Marcus agreed to restitution of the $300,000, drawn from his share of the remaining marital assets, and a payment plan for the balance. I received the house, which meant Sophie's school and neighborhood and bedroom stayed intact. I received primary custody, with Marcus having scheduled parenting time contingent on continued health and housing stability. We agreed to a structured co-parenting framework that Mr. Bertrand Okafor described as detailed enough to prevent ambiguity, which I took to mean detailed enough to prevent Marcus from improvising. I did not receive everything I'd spent. The business was gone. The rental property was gone. The money I had borrowed against the house would take years to pay down. But I had the house, my daughter, my legal standing, and $300,000 coming back to me in increments. It was not justice in the full sense of the word. It was the best possible version of what was survivable. I found out through Rachel, who had kept a peripheral eye on Lakeview Consulting's filings, that Adrian dissolved the company 4 months after the divorce was finalized. I don't know what happened between her and Marcus. I don't ask. Marcus is alive and recovering and living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Oak Park. He sees Sophie on alternating weekends. Sophie has adapted the way children do, with a kind of matter-of-fact resilience that I find both heartbreaking and inspiring. She asked me once why Daddy didn't live with us anymore. I said that sometimes grown-ups make choices that change the shape of a family, but that didn't change how much we both loved her. She thought about that for a second and then asked if we could have pancakes for dinner. I said yes. I went back to work. I took a position managing catering operations for a hotel group downtown. Not my own business, but good work, good people, and a salary that let me start chipping away at the debt. I started developing a small private client list on the side. Weekends only, low overhead. Nothing like what Bright Table was. Not yet, but it's mine. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from realizing the person you would have called in a crisis is the crisis. I spent a lot of evenings that first year sitting at the kitchen table after Sophie was asleep, drinking tea. I didn't particularly want, just being very quiet. My sister called often. Rachel checked in. That was enough. Something I did not expect. The anger faded faster than the grief. The anger was hot and clarifying, and it got me through the filing, the negotiations, the paperwork. But grief is slower and more patient. Grieving a marriage means grieving the version of your life you thought you were living. The Sunday mornings, the plans you made, the way you said we about the future. I still say we sometimes by accident about things. It catches me off guard and then passes. One evening in late spring, about 8 months after everything was finalized, I was picking Sophie up from her after-school program. Her teacher stopped me to say that Sophie had organized the other kids during free play, had assigned everyone a job and run a very efficient pretend restaurant. She's a natural leader, the teacher said. Very calm under pressure. Gets everyone working together. I stood there in the school hallway and felt something unlock in my chest that I hadn't realized was locked. I drove home with Sophie, chattering about who ordered what at her pretend restaurant, and I thought, you came through it. You are not who you were before, but you came through it. And what you built before, you can build again. Different shape, steadier foundation. Yours. The house looked the same, pulling into the driveway. Sophie's bike was on the lawn. The porch light was on because I'd left it on. It was ordinary and imperfect and completely mine. I had spent $500,000 trying to save a marriage I didn't know was already over. I had sold my life's work for a man who was planning to leave me before he ever got sick. I had signed documents with steady hands, not knowing I was dismantling the only security I had. And I was still here. My daughter was still here. The porch light was still here. The porch light was still on. Some losses you don't recover from. You just build a new life on the other side of them, and you make sure it's a life no one else can take from you. I'm still working on that part, but I'm working on it. People ask me sometimes if I regret saving him. It's always asked carefully, like they're not sure they're allowed to ask it. And I understand why. Because on the surface it sounds like a monstrous question. Do you regret keeping your husband alive? But I know what they're really asking. They're asking whether it was worth it, whether I'd do it again knowing what I know now. Here's what I figured out, sitting with that question for the better part of a year. The choice I made was the right one, not because Marcus deserved it. He didn't. But because I made it based on who I was, not who he was. I sold Bright Table and signed those papers and drove him to Houston because that's what a person with integrity does when someone they love is in danger. The fact that he was secretly funding another woman's business while I was doing all of that, that's on him. That doesn't retroactively make my choice wrong. It makes his choices catastrophic. There's something important in that distinction. We tend to measure whether we did the right thing by how it turned out. If it worked out, we were wise. If it didn't, we were naive. But that's not actually how integrity operates. Integrity is about what you knew at the time and what you chose to do with that knowledge. I chose to save my husband's life because I genuinely believed in our marriage. That belief turned out to be misplaced. But the choice still came from a decent place. I can live with that. What I can't live with, and what I refused to accept once I knew the truth, was letting it continue. That's where the second part of the story lives, and it's the part I'm actually proud of. Not the sacrifice, the clarity. The moment in the bathroom when I looked at myself and decided I was done performing helplessness, done being the wife who sees something wrong and talks herself out of believing her own eyes. Done making it easy for someone to use my steadiness against me. Rachel, Mr. Okafor, Ellis. I didn't wait for someone to rescue me. I built the team myself, quietly, while still making Marcus's meals and driving him to his checkups. That's not cold. That's what it looks like when someone who has been through genuine hardship decides to apply the same discipline that got them through it to getting themselves out. You don't fall apart. You get organized. Marcus made a series of choices over years, each one small enough to rationalize, probably that compounded into something that destroyed his family and nearly destroyed me. That's how it usually works. It's rarely one dramatic decision. It's 100 small ones, each slightly worse than the last, each one betting that the other person won't notice or won't act. He bet on my loyalty blinding me. He was wrong about that. Sophie starts second grade in the fall. She told me last week that she wants to run a restaurant when she grows up, but a real one, not pretend. I told her that sounded exactly right. She has her father's confidence and, I hope, none of his judgment. I'm still rebuilding. The debt is real, the loss is real, and some mornings it sits on my chest before I'm fully awake. But I know exactly what I'm working with and exactly what I'm working toward. Nobody is moving money out of accounts I don't know about. Nobody is making plans that don't include me. That's not a small thing. That's everything.